At my dad's while reading, my stepmother sat at the head of the table like a queen, my smug step-siblings flanking her. The lawyer read a will that almost erased me, then reached for a hidden envelope and a USB drive my father had never told them about. I sat in my car outside the law office, watching fat drops of Ohio rain streak down the windshield and blur the neat gold letters on the glass door. Caldwell and Pierce, attorneys at law. My wipers squeaked across the glass, clearing the view for a second. Inside, through the frosted pane, I saw three familiar silhouettes. One slender, rigid posture with a perfectly straight spine and a bob of glossy blonde hair. Two others slouched beside her, all elbows and crossed arms, like they owned the place. My stepmother, Valerie. My stepbrother, Chase. My stepsister, Lily. They were already here. Of course they were. I sat there with the engine idling, fingers clenched so tight around the steering wheel that the fake leather dug into my palms. My heart pounded against my ribs, that thick mix of grief and anger and something else I couldn't quite name. Dread. They thought today would be the coronation ceremony. That's what it looked like from out here. Anyway, a smug little victory parade at my father's while reading. I took a slow breath and forced my hand off the wheel. The air in the car smelled faintly of stale coffee and the pine-scented air freshener that had been dangling from the mirror for months. I pulled my tie straighter, glancing down at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't look like I felt. I looked like any other 32-year-old man in a black suit and a tired face, coming to hear how much the dead had left behind. But inside, it felt like I was walking into a courtroom, not a conference room. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about 15 years of being slowly erased from my own father's life. My name is Daniel Hayes, only son of Richard Hayes, founder of Hayes Civil and Steel. If you live anywhere near Cincinnati, you've probably driven over one of our bridges or walked past one of our buildings without even knowing it. When I was a kid, Dad used to toss me in the truck on Saturday mornings and drive me out to sites, pointing at half-finished girders like they were artwork in a gallery. One day, "This will all be yours, Danny," he'd say, slapping his calloused hand against my shoulder so hard I'd stumble. "You'll sign the checks, not haul the rebar." Back then, I believed him. Back then, it was just me, Dad, and my mom, Claire, in our little brick house on Maple Street. Mom made pancakes every Sunday. Dad taught me the difference between an I-beam and an H-beam before I could ride a bike without training wheels. We weren't rich yet, but you could feel something building. Momentum. Then, when I was 14, my mother's car spun out on black ice on the I-75, and she never came home. There are some moments you remember as colors and sounds, not words. The way the kitchen light flickered when Dad turned it on that night. The way the police officer's hat brim dripped water onto the tile. Dad's hands shaking on the back of a chair he never sat down in. After that, everything was work. My father buried himself in it. The company exploded in size. We went from a handful of local projects to county contracts, then state work. Our names started appearing on the side of cranes and concrete trucks all over southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. At school, kids who used to ignore me suddenly knew my last name and what it meant. At home, it was just empty rooms and Dad coming in late, smelling of concrete dust and cold air, eating whatever leftovers I'd kept in the oven for him. We didn't talk about Mom. We didn't talk about much at all. And then one summer afternoon, when I was 17, he came home with her. Valerie. I remember the way she swept into the house like she was walking onto a stage. White blouse, pencil skirt, heels that clicked on the hardwood. A spray of perfume that smelled expensive and sharp, like cut citrus and something floral I couldn't name. Her hair was perfect. Her nails were perfect. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes, when they landed on me, were not. "So," she'd said, looking me up and down like I was a contractor who'd underbid a project. "This must be Daniel." Dad had the look of a teenager again, awkward and eager, like he wanted me to approve. He couldn't see the calculation in her glance. Or maybe he could and pretended not to. Within 6 months, she was Mrs. Hayes. Within a year, she and her 2 kids had moved into the house on Maple Street. The framed photos of my mother started disappearing from shelves, replaced by abstract art prints and scented candles. My mother's old piano was sold to make space. Valerie said the house needed to be updated if it was going to reflect who the Hayes family was now. She never said my mother's name out loud. Chase and Lily were 20 and 18 when they moved in. She'd had them in her first marriage, the one that ended with a quiet settlement and a slightly larger diamond ring. They were older than me by a few years, already half-formed in a mold I didn't recognize, spoiled, charming, always just on the edge of broke despite their designer clothes. From the beginning, there were rules, mostly unwritten, but clear. We didn't talk about the past unless it was about how hard Dad had worked, alone. We didn't mention my mother at the dinner table. We didn't question the way money flowed. New BMW for Chase within 3 months, a semester abroad in Florence for Lily, a remodel of the kitchen to suit Valerie's aesthetic. Dad seemed happy, or at least less hollow. And every time I started to bristle, he'd clap a heavy hand on my shoulder and say, "Let it go, Danny. It's just money. We're family." So I tried. I went to college for civil engineering, just like he wanted. Interned summers in the company office instead of backpacking Europe like my classmates. When I graduated, I didn't send out resumes. There was never any question where I'd work. Hey, Civil and Steel wasn't just a company. It was the closest thing I had left to my father. For the first few years, it was good. Long hours, yes, but I was learning everything from the ground up. I started in project management, then moved into estimating. Dad would still stomp into my cubicle sometimes and drag me out to a site to smell the damn concrete and see what the numbers actually mean. We'd stand on half-finished overpasses in the Ohio wind, and for a second it felt like that kid in the truck was still inside him. Then the subtle shifts began. "Maybe you should move into more of a strategic role," Valerie said one night over one of her meticulously planned dinners. She always said the word as if strategy were synonymous with staying out of the way. "You don't have to be on site all the time. You're not a laborer." That's how he learns the business, Dad said, but his voice didn't have the same bite it once did. "You can learn from the reports," she replied with a smooth smile. "Besides, you'll need to understand the financial side more if you're going to be, She let the sentence hang, like a lure. If you're going to be the heir. I saw the way my father straightened at that. The way his ego relaxed under her hand on his arm. But over the next few months, email chains stopped including me. Big decisions got made in informal meetings I wasn't invited to. When I asked about a restructuring plan that would significantly increase Valerie's influence on the board, officially as head of corporate development, Dad just shrugged. "You're young, Danny. You've got time. Let us old folks worry about that stuff." Old folks. Valerie was 12 years younger than him and 10 older than me. But in that moment, it felt like I'd been pushed into a different generation entirely. Then came the first real cut. It was at the Christmas party, in the twinkling glow of rented chandeliers and clinked champagne flutes in the biggest ballroom in Cincinnati. The company had just landed a state contract that would carry us through the next 5 years. People were drunk on success and actual liquor. Dad took the microphone to make a speech. He talked about starting in a rusted-out pickup with a toolbox in the back, about near-bankrupt years and stubborn grit. He thanked my rock, Valerie, and kissed her on the cheek as the crowd applauded. "And," he said, "I couldn't have done it without my right hand these last few years." He reached out. For a split second, standing near the front, my heart leapt. Then he clasped Chase on the shoulder. "Chase has stepped up in ways I never expected," Dad boomed. "He's got a good head for the big picture. The future of Hayes Civil and Steel is in very capable hands." I stood there, holding a champagne flute I suddenly couldn't taste, while Chase grinned and accepted the applause. Our eyes met for a second. He raised his glass to me and smirked. Later that night, when I cornered Dad in his office, something bitter burned in my throat. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Your right hand? Since when does Chase even show up before 10? Dad rubbed his temples, the glamour of the evening slipping. "Don't start, Danny. He's been helping with the expansion into Kentucky. The investors like him. I've been running point on that project for a year," I said. "Those investors only met him because I brought him in." He sighed. "This isn't a competition. It feels like one," I shot back. "And I'm the only one who didn't know we were playing." He looked at me like I'd disappointed him, like I'd made it about myself. "That attitude," he said quietly, "is why they don't see you as leadership yet. You get too personal." I walked out of his office that night with my ears ringing, the sound of the party upstairs a muffled mockery. I told myself it was fine, that titles didn't matter as much as my actual work, that one speech didn't erase the years of concrete under my nails. But it didn't stop. By the time I was 30, I was being eased out of decision-making meetings to keep things efficient. Valerie would send me summaries of calls I should have been on. Chase's name appeared beside more and more initiatives I'd started. Lily was brought in as creative director for a rebrand that cost six figures and produced a logo I could have made in PowerPoint. Through it all, my father kept saying the same thing. Don't make trouble, Danny. Your family. You'll be taken care of. That phrase, you'll be taken care of, started to sound less like comfort and more like a leash. Thoughts I'd never allowed myself began to creep in around the edges. Thoughts about wills and shares, and who would actually control Hayes Civil and Steel when my father was gone. I'd never cared about the money, not really. Not beyond wanting my work and sacrifice to mean something. But watching my stepmother and her children treat the company like an ATM with better decor started to make me anxious in ways I didn't want to admit. So one afternoon, on a day when the sky was the flat gray of unfinished concrete, I found myself in the office of Dad's longtime attorney, Michael Caldwell. We'd known Michael since I was 10. He'd been there when Dad signed the papers to incorporate the company, when the first big contracts came in, when my parents bought the house. He'd been there when my mother died. He'd come to the funeral with a casserole dish his wife had made, looking out of place in our kitchen but standing quietly in a corner like a sentry. "Something on your mind, Daniel?" he asked, after I spent 10 minutes talking about operational risk and long-term planning instead of the real reason I was there. I hesitated. Then I blurted, "Do you still handle my father's estate planning?" Michael studied me over his glasses the way only a man pushing 70 can. "Yes," he said slowly. "I do." "Has he changed anything recently?" "That," he replied gently, "is a conversation between your father and me." I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. Of course it was. Attorney-client privilege. I knew the words, but they'd never felt like a wall between me and my own blood before. I started, then stopped. "I'm worried." "About what?" "That I'm being phased out," I said, the phrase tasting ugly. "At the company. In the family. Everywhere." Michael was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the ticking of an old brass clock on his bookshelf. "Daniel," he said finally, "your father has always spoken of you as his son and as his intended successor. Whatever storms are happening in that house, I don't believe he's forgotten that." I wanted to believe him. But less than a year later, my father collapsed in his office from a massive heart attack. He was 64. I was in a meeting 2 floors down when someone burst into the room, face white, saying, "It's Mr. Hayes. Call an ambulance." I can still hear the panicked shouts, the flurry of movement, the smell of antiseptic when the paramedics arrived. I remember standing there, utterly useless, as they tried to bring him back. They didn't. Valerie appeared at the hospital in oversized sunglasses and a black coat that looked expensive and theatrical. She clung to my arm and sobbed loud, heaving sobs that turned heads in the waiting room. I patted her back awkwardly, feeling like I was comforting a stranger at my own father's death. At the funeral, she turned it into a spectacle. Huge floral arrangements in the shape of bridges. A glossy slideshow that featured more photos of Dad with her and her kids than with me and my mother. Chase gave a speech about the visionary who took a chance on us. Lily cried on cue, mascara perfectly smudged. No one asked me to speak. After the burial, after the murmured condolences and the endless plates of food sent by people who didn't know what else to do, I caught Valerie in the kitchen of the big house, swirling a glass of red wine and staring out the window. "Valerie," I said, forcing myself to be calm, "we need to talk about the company and about arrangements." She turned slowly, one eyebrow arching. "Arrangements?" "Dad's will," I said. "His shares. The house. All of it." "Oh, Daniel." She let out a small laugh. "Always so serious." "This is serious," I replied. "People are already asking questions. We need to know who's in charge." She studied me for a long moment, then took a sip of her wine. "You don't need to worry about that," she said finally. "Your father took care of everything." That phrase again. "You saw the will?" I asked. "Of course." She smiled, and there was steel in it. "He left the controlling interest in the company to me. Temporarily, until Chase is ready to take over. The house and the personal accounts as well." Her eyes glittered. "Don't worry," she added, like she was throwing a dog a bone. "You're not completely forgotten. There's a trust for you. A very generous one, considering everything. Everything. My childhood. My work. My name." I felt the kitchen tilt a little. That doesn't sound like what he told me. I managed. People say many things in the abstract, she said, her tone suddenly chilling. But when the papers are signed, well, that's what counts, isn't it? My jaw clenched. I'd like to see the documents, I said. With Michael. Michael is retiring soon, she replied smoothly. We'll be moving our legal matters to a new firm. More modern. I'll let you know when we're ready to include you. I left the kitchen with a taste in my mouth like rust. That night, alone in my small apartment, because I'd never moved into the big house, no matter how many times Dad asked, I stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning, I called Michael. He sounded older on the phone than he had in his office, like the last year had added a decade. Yes, Daniel, he said quietly. We need to talk. Which is how I ended up here, sitting in my car outside his office, watching Valerie and her children's blurred shapes through the rain. She was so sure. I could see it in the tilt of her chin when she'd walked in. In the way Chase texted without a care in the world, his designer watch flashing. In the way Lily flipped her hair and laughed at something her brother said, like this was all just a formality before they went out to celebrate. In their minds, the story was already written. The grieving widow, the loyal stepchildren, the foolish biological son who was lucky to get whatever scraps fell from their table. They didn't know the whole story yet. They didn't know that 2 weeks before Dad died, he'd shown up at my apartment unannounced, looking tired and older than I'd ever seen him. That he'd sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd barely touched, while he said things I never expected to hear. They didn't know what he'd asked me to help him do. They didn't know what Michael had locked away in his office safe, waiting for today. I reached up and turned off the ignition. The engine died, leaving only the drumming of the rain and the dull thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. My hand found the cool metal of the key fob, the familiar weight of the small silver keychain my mother had given me when I got my first car. A simple thing, a tiny engraved bridge. Remember where you come from, she'd said, smiling as she pressed it into my palm. I squeezed it now until the edges bit into my skin. Remember, I whispered to myself. Then I opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, walking toward the glass door and the smirks waiting on the other side. The bell above the office door jingled as I stepped inside, a soft, old-fashioned sound that didn't fit the knot of tension in my chest. Warm air hit my damp suit. The place smelled like coffee, paper, and the faint lemon polish Michael had probably been using on this furniture for decades. The front desk was just as I remembered from childhood, dark wood, neatly stacked folders, a little bowl of peppermint candies. Behind it sat the same receptionist, Mrs. Carter, though her hair was whiter now, pulled into a tight bun. She looked up, and for a fraction of a second, her face softened. Daniel, she said quietly, I'm so sorry about your father. I nodded, the usual reflexive thank you dying in my throat. My voice came out rough. Is everyone here? Her eyes flicked past my shoulder toward the rain still lashing the street, then to the partially closed door of the conference room down the hall. They're waiting, she said. You can go on in. Mr. Caldwell will be right with you. I walked down the hallway, my shoes sinking slightly into the worn runner rug, years of footsteps pressing the fibers flat. The door to the main conference room was open a few inches. Laughter leaked through, a bright, careless sound that made my jaw clench. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. Valerie was seated at the head of the table, where Michael usually sat when we met. She had on a black dress that managed to be both somber and aggressively expensive, with a string of pearls that probably cost more than my car. Her blonde hair was immaculate, not a strand out of place. She looked perfectly composed, perfectly in control. At her right sat Chase, sprawled back in his chair like he was at a sports bar, one ankle crossed over his knee, phone in his hand. At her left sat Lily, scrolling through something on her own screen, a to-go coffee cup with some hipster logo sweating on the polished wood. They all looked up when I entered. For a heartbeat, no one said anything. Then Valerie's lips curved in that familiar, practiced smile. Daniel, she said, as if she'd just run into me at a charity gala. You made it. I took the empty chair opposite her, at the far end of the table. The distance felt deliberate, like stage blocking, her at one end as queen, me at the other as something else. An afterthought. A formality. I was invited, I said. She laughed lightly, the sound brittle around the edges. Well, of course, Richard insisted. The past tense twisted in my gut. Chase slid his phone into his pocket, looking me over like he was assessing a competitor at an open house. "Rough weather out there, huh?" he said. "Hope you didn't hydroplane in that. What do you drive now?" "The Honda." "It gets me where I need to go," I replied. His gaze flicked to my suit, then away. "Sure." Lily didn't bother with small talk. She just gave me a quick, tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes and went back to her phone. I rested my hands on the table, forcing myself to unclench them. "Where's Michael?" I asked. Valerie glanced at the clock on the wall, a large, antique thing that ticked loudly enough to cut through the silence. "Any minute now," she said. "He's getting things." Her eyes gleamed briefly, then she smoothed her expression back to polite neutrality. "I know this is hard, but your father was very clear about his wishes. Once it's all formalized, we can all move on." Move on. From my father. From the life I thought I was building. From the company he and I had poured ourselves into. I stared at the condensation ring forming under Lily's coffee cup, at the way it blurred her reflection on the table's surface. My throat felt dry. Before I could respond, Michael walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. His suit hung a little looser on his shoulders, and his hair, once merely gray, had faded to nearly white. But his eyes were still sharp behind his glasses, taking in the room in a single sweep. "Good morning," he said quietly. Everyone murmured faint greetings. He gave a small nod to Valerie, a slightly longer one to me. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chairs even though we were already seated, an old habit of courtesy he'd never shaken. "Let's begin." He took his place at the head of the table, nudging aside the folder Valerie had laid there as if reclaiming the spot by muscle memory. He placed his leather portfolio down, opened it, and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. "First," he said, his voice taking on the formal cadence I'd heard at other people's readings over the years, "I want to extend my condolences once again. I've known Richard Hayes for over 30 years. He was a singular man." Valerie dabbed at the corner of one eye with a tissue, a gesture that looked rehearsed. Chase stared at the ceiling. Lily sighed quietly. Michael went on. "As you know, we are here to read and execute the last will and testament of Richard Allen Hayes. Executed." He glanced at the top page, roughly 5 years ago. "Under Ohio law, I am obligated to inform you that this document revokes all prior wills and codicils made by the decedent." 5 years ago. I did the math automatically. That would have been right in the middle of the Valerie era. 2 years after they married. Right around the time she started redoing the house and the company org chart. My stomach tightened. Michael broke the seal on the envelope with a practiced motion and slid out a stack of papers. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. "It is my will that all my just debts, funeral expenses, and expenses of last illness be first paid out of my estate." The dry legal language rolled over us, that familiar litany about debts and taxes and residue. I half heard it, my mind skimming ahead to the part everyone in the room was really waiting for. The bequests. Michael's voice never wavered. "To my wife, Valerie and Hayes, I give, devise, and bequeath the residence at 41 Oak Ridge Lane, together with all furnishings and personal property therein, to be hers absolutely and forever." Valerie's chin lifted a fraction of an inch, as if acknowledging applause from an invisible audience. "To my children by marriage, Chase Andrew Collins and Lillian Grace Collins," Michael continued, "I give, devise, and bequeath 51% of my shares in Hayes Civil and Steel Incorporated, to be divided between them in equal portions, together with any voting rights and privileges attached thereto." Chase's hand flexed on the armrest, his knuckles going white for a second before he caught himself and turned it into a casual stretch. Lily's eyes snapped up from her phone, something like real excitement flickering there for the first time all morning. My heart thudded once, heavy. 51%. Controlling interest. My father had always told me the company would be mine, that I'd sign the checks, not haul the rebar. And yet here, on paper, it was being handed to two people who had never done more than show up for photo ops and cash dividend checks. Michael kept reading, his tone neutral. "To my son, Daniel James Hayes, I give, devise, and bequeath the remaining 49% of my shares in Hayes Civil and Steel Incorporated, to be held in trust under the management of my wife, Valerie and Hayes, until such time as she shall deem it appropriate to release said shares to him, or until her death, whichever shall first occur." Every word hit like a stone. Held in trust. Under Valerie. She made a small, sympathetic noise, like she was comforting a child who hadn't gotten the bigger slice of cake. Additionally, Michael went on, I give, devise, and bequeath to my son, Daniel, the sum of $100,000, to be distributed to him free of trust upon my death. $100,000. It was a lot of money. To most people. To the man my father had become. To the company he'd built. It was a rounding error. That seems fair, Valerie said softly, breaking protocol by speaking before Michael had finished. You'll be comfortable, Daniel. Chase snorted. More than most people get, he muttered. Something cold settled in my chest. Not shock exactly. I'd expected something like this after the conversation in the kitchen. But hearing it read aloud, the injustice stamped in black and white, pressed down on me like a weight. I looked at Michael. His jaw was a little tighter than usual. He continued down the will, reading smaller bequests to a couple of charities my father had supported, instructions for the sale of some vacant land, and the appointment of executors. As expected, Valerie was named primary executor. If she couldn't serve, Chase would. Not me. When he reached the last page of the document, he read the closing language, the standard lines about being of sound mind and body by signature and seal. Then he set the will down, lining up the edges with an almost obsessive neatness. That, he said, is the last will and testament of Richard Allen Hayes, dated June 14th, 5 years ago. Silence descended. Thick, suffocating. Valerie let out a slow breath, like someone who'd just completed a difficult yoga pose. Well, she said, carefully putting her tissue away, that settles it then. I know this is a lot to absorb, Daniel. But as you can see, your father made generous provision for you. The trust, the cash gift. You control the trust, I said, my voice steady but edged. You control whether I ever see those shares. She tilted her head, that patronizing look I'd come to know too well. I'll do what's best for the company, she said. For all of us. That's what Richard wanted. Lily leaned forward, eyes bright. So, does this mean Chase and I are, like, the majority owners now? She asked. In due course, Valerie said quickly. We'll work out the transition with the board. This isn't something we rush. Right, Michael? Michael didn't answer immediately. He was still watching me. His gaze flicked down to my right hand, where without realizing it I'd been turning my mother's little bridge keychain around and around between my fingers. I caught his eye. A memory jolted through me like a sudden power surge. My father at my kitchen table 2 weeks before he died. His hands shaking a little as he wrapped them around the coffee mug. The way he'd looked at me then, not as a disappointment or a problem to be managed, but as something closer to an equal. He'd taken a long breath. I did something stupid, Danny, he'd said, staring into his cup. Something I let myself be talked into. When I'd asked, about what? About the will. He'd looked up then, eyes clearing. About the company. About you. I remember the way my pulse had jumped. The way the air in the small kitchen had seemed to thin. What did you do? I'd asked quietly. He'd laughed once, bitterly. I let Valerie drag me to a new estate planner she liked, he said. This slick guy with a fancy office and a wall of degrees. She said Michael was old-fashioned, that we needed someone who understood modern wealth. I should have seen it coming a mile away. I had gripped the edge of the table. Did you change the will? I asked. I signed papers, he said, shame flickering across his face. Too many of them. I told myself I was just updating things, making sure she'd be secure. They worded it so damn carefully. Next thing I know, Chase is joint managing member on things he has no business touching, and you're stuck. Stuck how? I demanded. In some trust structure I don't like the smell of, he said. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Heard your mother's voice in my head calling me a damn fool. The admission had stunned me. My father never talked about regretting anything. He never talked about hearing my mother at all. So undo it, I'd said. You can change it. I can, he replied. And I will. But it has to be done right. Quietly. Valerie pays attention to the wrong things. She's got her claws in a lot more than she lets on. He'd fallen silent then, drumming his fingers on the table. Then he'd looked up, resolve settling over his features. I went to see Michael last week, he said. Had him draw up a new will. Properly. One that reflects what I actually want. Hope and suspicion had warred in my chest. What do you want? I asked. For you to control Hayes Civil and Steel, he said simply. Not Valerie. Not Chase. You. You're the one who knows what the hell you're doing. You're the one who'll keep it honest. My throat had tightened. Dad. He held up a hand. I'm not saying they get nothing, he added. I'm not a monster. The house, some cash, sure. But the company? That's different. That's our name. He'd reached into his jacket then and pulled out a small, plain USB flash drive. One of the cheap ones you can get in a pack of 10. I want part of it on here, he'd said. I'd frowned. Part of what? The details, he replied. Specific instructions. Things I don't want sitting in a drawer Valerie can snoop through. Michael says electronic annexes are allowed now, as long as they're properly referenced and secured. But I don't trust myself with the tech. He'd given me a sheepish look then, one that made him seem suddenly not like the invincible patriarch of my childhood, but like an aging man aware of his blind spots. I need you to set it up, he said. Encrypted. Put whatever locks and keys you smart kids use these days. Something only you and Michael can crack. Something no one else will even know exists unless we want them to. I remember staring at the little piece of plastic and metal, feeling the weight of what he was asking. It wasn't just a favor. It was my father quietly admitting that he'd let himself be manipulated, and that he wanted me to help him take control back. Why me? I'd asked, even though I knew the answer. Because you're the only one I trust to care more about the company than about cashing a quick check, he'd said bluntly. And because Valerie can wrap me around her finger when she really tries. I won't pretend otherwise. This way, there's a fail-safe she can't access. We'd spent the rest of that afternoon at my cheap kitchen table, my laptop open, my father leaning close as I walked him through options he half understood. We set up an encrypted folder with a password only he and I knew. A phrase from an old bridge design he'd shown me when I was 10, one I'd scrawled in my school notebooks for years. We titled the document inside simply, Annex A, Hayes Civil and Steel. When we were done, he'd held the USB drive in his palm like it was something sacred. I'll give this to Michael, he'd said. Have him lock it up. He'll know when to use it. He'd stood then, joints creaking a little, and put his hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry it took me this long to wake up, he'd murmured. Your mother always said my stubbornness would either build us an empire or sink us. Help me make sure it's the first one. That had been the last real conversation we'd ever had. Now, sitting in Michael's conference room, I watched his eyes flick from my keychain to my face. Something passed between us, an understanding, a cue. He cleared his throat. As I said, he repeated, the document we have just read is the last will and testament executed 5 years ago. Valerie nodded quickly. Yes, we heard you. Thank you, Michael. I'm sure there's plenty of paperwork too. However, he said, raising his voice just enough to cut her off without seeming rude. Mr. Hayes executed additional testamentary instruments more recently, which I am also obligated to present. The words hung in the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Valerie's smile froze. I'm sorry, she said. What additional instruments? Michael reached down to his briefcase and pulled out a small, dark metal key I didn't recognize. He stood, walked to the far wall, and stopped in front of a tall filing cabinet. Above it, nearly invisible from where we were sitting, was a small safe recessed into the wall. I'd never noticed it before. He inserted the key, turned it, and there was a soft click. He twisted the knob, opened the safe, and reached inside. When he turned back, he was holding a plain, unmarked envelope and a small, unremarkable black USB drive. My heartbeat kicked up, suddenly loud in my ears. Valerie's eyes locked onto the USB like it was a snake. What is that? She demanded. Michael resumed his seat, placing the items carefully on the table in front of him. His hands were steady. This, he said, tapping the envelope, is a codicil, an amendment, to the will we have just read. It was executed 16 days before Mr. Hayes passed away, in my presence and in the presence of 2 witnesses. He picked up the USB between thumb and forefinger. And this, he added, is an electronic annex containing specific directives from Mr. Hayes regarding his business interests. It is referenced in the codicil and secured in accordance with Ohio law. Chase leaned forward, his facade of bored confidence cracking. He never told us about that, he said. Why wouldn't he tell us? Because it wasn't your business, I said quietly. Valerie shot me a look that could have stripped paint. Why are we only hearing about this now? She snapped at Michael. Richard and I discussed his estate thoroughly. I was his wife. I was supposed to be the executor. This feels highly irregular. Michael met her gaze without flinching. Mr. Hayes was entitled to change his testamentary arrangements at any time, he said. He chose to do so with me, as his attorney. He also instructed me explicitly not to disclose the existence of the codicil or the annex until we had concluded the reading of the prior will and all named beneficiaries were present. And Daniel knew? She asked, her voice sharpening. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Her lips thinned. This is outrageous, she hissed. Richard would never go behind my back this way. Michael unfolded the envelope with unhurried care. With respect, he said, he already did. He slid out a single page of heavy paper, covered in that familiar tight, slanted handwriting. My father's. My throat closed for a second at the sight of it. We will read the codicil first, Michael said. Then, if necessary, we will access the annex. Valerie opened her mouth again, but he spoke over her, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone who had always quietly known where the real power in a room lay. Please, he said, let me do my job. He began to read. And just like that, the ground under Valerie's smirk started to shift. Michael cleared his throat and began to read from the single sheet of the codicil. I, Richard Allen Hayes, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby make this codicil to my last will and testament dated June 14. He paused, eyes scanning the top. Executed 5 years prior to this instrument. The legal cadence was back, but underneath it I could hear something else. Regret, maybe, or the weight of what he knew was coming. First, he read, I hereby revoke Article 4, Sections B and C of my said will, regarding the disposition of my shares in Hayes Civil and Steel Incorporated and any trusts associated therewith. Valerie's fingers tightened around her tissue. The slight crinkle was loud in the silence. What does that mean? Lily whispered, glancing at her. It means, Michael continued, that the prior provisions gifting 51% of my shares to my stepchildren and placing the remaining 49% in trust under the management of my wife shall be of no force and effect. For the first time since I'd entered the room, Chase actually looked rattled. What? He said, sitting forward so abruptly his chair squeaked. He can't just take that back. He could, Michael said mildly. And he did. Chase's mouth opened, then snapped shut as his mother shot him a warning look. Michael went on. In lieu thereof, he read, I give, devise, and bequeath all of my shares in Hayes Civil and Steel Incorporated, whether now owned or hereafter acquired, into a trust to be known as the Hayes Legacy Trust. He shifted the page to catch the light. I appoint as trustee of said trust my son, Daniel James Hayes, who shall have full authority to vote, manage, and dispose of said shares for the benefit of the trust and its beneficiaries, subject to the instructions set forth in Annex A, referenced herein. The words hit me like a physical blow, not in a painful way. More like someone had suddenly taken a cinder block off my chest I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for 5 years. Trustee. Full authority. Valerie's face went pale, then flushed an angry red. That's absurd, she snapped. Richard would never put Daniel in sole control. He relied on me for those decisions. I was his partner. I am also, Michael continued, ignoring her outburst, appointing my son, Daniel, as co-executor of my estate together with my attorney, Michael Caldwell, in place of my wife, who shall serve only as successor executor should both of them be unable or unwilling to act. She let out a small, incredulous laugh. This is insane, she said. You're telling me he removed me as executor? Behind my back? That is the effect of this instrument, yes? Michael said. Valerie turned to me then, eyes flashing. You knew about this, she said. Didn't you? I met her gaze and, for the first time in a very long time, didn't look away. He came to me, I said quietly, after you took him to that modern lawyer and handed my company over to your children on paper. Her lips compressed into a thin line. Michael cleared his throat again, pulling our attention back to him. Furthermore, he read, I direct that if any beneficiary under my will or this codicil shall contest the validity of these instruments, or of any provision herein, or shall in any manner seek to impair or invalidate any of their provisions, then all benefits provided for such beneficiary are hereby revoked, and shall pass as if such beneficiary had predeceased me, without issue. Chase blinked. What? He said. What did he just say? It's a no contest clause, Lily murmured, surprising me with the fact that she seemed to understand. If we fight this in court, we can lose everything. Valerie's jaw worked. He can't do that, she said. He can't threaten us into complying. He wasn't threatening, Michael said evenly. He was clarifying. He wished to avoid extended litigation tearing the family and the company apart. It's not an uncommon provision. She stared at him like she wanted to claw his eyes out. You let him do this, she whispered. I advised him of his options, Michael replied. He made his own decisions. Silence fell. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the heating vents. I sat there, absorbing it. The reversal. The fact that the ink that had once signed me into a corner had now signed me out of it. But there was still the small black USB drive sitting on the table between us like a loaded gun. An annex, eh? I asked, my voice coming out lower than I intended. Michael looked at me, then at Valerie and her children. Annex A, he said, contains specific instructions from your father regarding the governance of Hayes Civil and Steel, including but not limited to pre-signed shareholder agreements, directives to the board of directors, and a personal statement of intent, recorded in his own voice. Chase let out a shaky laugh. A video, he said. Seriously? Lily shifted in her seat, suddenly uneasy. I don't think I want to watch a video of him, she muttered. It's weird. Valerie was staring at the drive like it might explode. Is that legal? She demanded. An electronic annex? We didn't agree to any of this. You were not required to agree, Michael said patiently. Only Mr. Hayes was. And yes, Ohio recognizes electronic documents as valid testamentary instruments when properly executed and referenced. Your husband was very clear that he wanted this to stand. My pulse picked up. That afternoon at my kitchen table flashed before me again. The lines around Dad's eyes, the way his hand had trembled just slightly when he first held the drive. My son will help me make sure you can't edit this, he'd joked to Michael, but we all knew there was truth under it. Michael set the USB on the table in front of him and slid his laptop closer. It was an old machine, heavy and well-worn, but maintained with the same care he gave his files. He plugged the drive in. A soft chime sounded. A password prompt popped up. Ah, he murmured. Daniel. Everyone's eyes swung to me. What? Lily asked. Why is he asking you? My fingers felt suddenly clumsy, but they remembered. I stood, circling the table until I could see the keyboard. The prompt blinked, waiting. I typed in the phrase my father and I had chosen together. Each keystroke a small act of defiance against the story Valerie thought she'd already finished writing. Pratt Trust 1989. The password field turned into asterisks. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the drive's light flickered, and a folder name appeared on the screen. NX__HCS. Michael double-clicked. Inside were a handful of files, a PDF labeled Shareholder Agreement, executed, another titled Board Resolution, Succession, an audio file, a video file with a date stamp from just over 2 weeks before Dad died. Michael's hand hovered over the trackpad. Shall we begin with the statement? He asked. Yes, I said. Valerie didn't answer. Chase sat back, arms crossed, jaw tight. Lily hunched a little, her coffee cup forgotten. Michael clicked on the video file. For a moment, the screen was black. Then it flickered, and my father's face filled the laptop display. He was sitting in this same conference room, I realized, the angle just slightly different. The lighting was unflattering, highlighting the lines on his forehead and the gray at his temples. He looked tired, older than he should have at 64. But his eyes were clear. My name is Richard Hayes, he said, looking straight into the camera. If you're seeing this, it means a couple of things. 1. Michael did what I asked and kept his mouth shut until the time was right. He shot a brief sideways glance off screen. You could hear Michael's faint chuckle in the background. 2. I'm not around to answer questions myself. I swallowed hard. He shifted in his chair, leaning a little closer. I made a mistake, he said. A damn big one. On the other side of the table, Valerie stiffened. A while back, I let myself get talked into signing some estate papers I didn't fully understand. I told myself I was just taking care of my wife, making sure she'd be comfortable. That's what a man's supposed to do, right? Provide. He gave a humorless smile. Turns out, What I signed would have handed the keys to my company to people who haven't poured a drop of sweat into it. Chase made a sound like he'd been slapped. I'm not saying Valerie and her kids don't deserve something, my father went on. They're my family, too, in their way. But Hayes Civil and Steel is different. That name, that work, that's not just numbers on a balance sheet. That's every early morning and late night since I was 23. That's Claire standing in the doorway with coffee when I came home covered in dust. That's my boy riding shotgun in the truck, listening to me rant about bridge loads instead of baseball scores. My throat closed. Valerie's fingers tightened so hard around her tissue that it tore. Daniel, my father said, and even though it was a recording, my head snapped up like he'd called me from across the room. If you're watching this, son, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took me this long to put in writing what I should have never let slip. The company is yours to run. You're the one who knows how. You're the one I trust to keep it honest. Don't let anyone make you think you didn't earn that. Heat rose behind my eyes. I blinked hard. As for the rest of you, he said, looking back into the camera, and for a moment it felt like he was staring straight at Valerie, at Chase, at Lily. This isn't about cutting you out. You'll see the numbers. You'll be more than taken care of. But you will not control Hayes Civil and Steel just because you married into my life or showed up when the checks got bigger. That's not how this works. Valerie made a strangled sound. If you're thinking about contesting this, he added, a wry edge returning to his voice, replay what Michael just read to you about the no contest clause. I have no interest in watching you tear each other apart in court. And frankly, I'm too old to deal with the drama from beyond the grave. A strained chuckle escaped someone. Maybe Lily, maybe me. It didn't matter. He sobered. I'm doing this, he said, because I forgot where I came from for a while. I let myself get dazzled by things that don't matter as much as I thought they did. Daniel reminded me. Claire would have reminded me if she were here to smack me upside the head like she used to. He smiled then, soft and sad. This is me trying to set things right before I run out of time to do it. He leaned back, exhaling. Michael, if you're there, thanks. Daniel, if you ever doubt yourself, don't. You've got more of me in you than you realize. And more of your mother. Thank God. He looked at the camera one last time. All right, he said. Let's get this over with before I change my mind. The screen went black. The silence afterward felt different. Heavier. Fuller. Valerie's shoulders had slumped, the fight momentarily knocked out of her by the sound of his voice cutting through all her narratives. Lily had one hand over her mouth, eyes glistening. Even Chase, for all his bluster, looked shaken. Michael cleared his throat softly. In addition to that statement, he said, Annex A contains a fully executed shareholder agreement transferring voting control of all Hayes Civil and Steel shares held by the estate into the Hayes Legacy Trust, effective immediately upon Mr. Hayes's death, with Daniel as trustee. He clicked open the PDF. The digital scan showed signatures at the bottom of dense pages of legal text. My father's bold scrawl, Michael's neat countersignature, two witnesses I recognized as old board members. There is also, he went on, a board resolution signed by all members during a special meeting 3 weeks before Mr. Hayes passed, naming Daniel as successor CEO and chairman upon Mr. Hayes's death or incapacity, subject to standard confirmation votes, which have already been recorded. Valerie shook her head slowly, as if she could physically dislodge what she was hearing. He never told me about any of this, she whispered. He told me to tell you this way, Michael said gently. Chase lurched to his feet, knocking his chair back. This is bullshit, he snapped. He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. You two coerced him. Daniel, you put this tech stuff in front of him and confused him. Michael's gaze hardened. Mr. Collins, he said, his formal tone returning like steel sliding back into a sheath. I have known your stepfather longer than you have been alive. He was perfectly lucid when he executed these documents. There are medical evaluations attached to the file attesting to his capacity on those dates. You are, of course, free to seek independent counsel, but I must remind you of the no contest clause. Chase opened his mouth, then closed it again, the calculation visible as he did the math in his head. Lily slumped in her chair, suddenly looking younger than I'd ever seen her. So what do we get now? She asked quietly. Michael folded his hands. Under the original will, unmodified by the codicil, he said, you and your brother would have shared 51% of the company's shares and certain cash bequests. Under the codicil and annex, your specific bequests are converted to fixed sums from the estate's liquid assets. Valerie's head snapped back up. How much? She demanded. Michael consulted his notes. Each of you, he said, looking at Chase and Lily, will receive the sum of $500,000, $500,000, free of trust, to be distributed upon settlement of the estate. Lily's eyes widened. Chase's too, despite himself. That's a lot of money, she said faintly. It is, Michael agreed. But it's not control, Chase muttered. No, Michael said. It is not. He turned to Valerie. You, Mrs. Hayes, he said, retain the residence and its contents, as per the original will. Additionally, you will receive the sum of $1 million, $1 million, adjusted for estate taxes, and a lifetime right to health insurance coverage through the company's executive plan, as Mr. Hayes wished you to be secure. Her face twisted. He left me $1 million in the house, she said slowly, as if testing the words. After everything I did for him. After I kept this family together. Valerie, I said quietly, surprising even myself. You'll never have to work again. You'll live very comfortably. Her head whipped toward me. That's not the point, she hissed. He humiliated me. He went behind my back. He trusted you more than me. He trusted me with the company, I said. That's all. That's everything, she shot back. I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say that would penetrate the hurt pride and wounded entitlement coiling around her like barbed wire. Michael closed the laptop with a soft click and unplugged the USB. He held it for a moment in his palm, then slid it back into a small, labeled envelope. This will remain part of the estate file, he said. Copies will be provided to all parties' counsel. Valerie stood abruptly. I'll be speaking to an attorney, she said, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. A real one, not my husband's old friend who seems to think my feelings don't matter. Of course, Michael said. You are entitled to your own representation. I only caution you, again, to consider the no contest clause. She gathered her bag, her movements jerky. Come on, she snapped to Chase and Lily. They hesitated. For a moment, Lily's gaze met mine. There was something there besides anger. Hurt, maybe. Confusion. For all their selfishness, they'd just had the narrative of their entire future yanked out from under them. Lily, I said. She blinked. I'm not your enemy, I said quietly. I never have been. Her mouth trembled. That's hard to believe right now, she murmured, then turned and followed her mother out. Chase lingered a second longer, jaw clenched, fists balled. I thought he might say something, throw a threat, a parting shot. Instead, he just glared at me with a kind of raw, impotent fury, then stalked out, slamming the door so hard the clock on the wall rattled. And then it was just me and Michael in the room, the echoes of their exit fading. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he exhaled. Are you all right, Daniel? He asked. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. I don't know, I admitted. I don't feel how I thought I would. How did you think you'd feel? Vindicated, I said. Triumphant. Something out of a bad movie where the good son wins and the wicked stepfamily gets what's coming to them. I shook my head. But mostly I just feel tired. And sad. He shouldn't have had to fix this at the last minute. No, Michael said softly. He shouldn't have. But he did. He slid the codicil across the table toward me, along with a copy of the annex summary. Now the question is, he said, what are you going to do with what he gave you? The next year was one of the hardest of my life. Valerie did exactly what she'd threatened. She hired a lawyer. A big downtown firm with shiny glass offices and a reputation for scorched earth tactics. They filed a challenge, arguing undue influence, lack of capacity, all the predictable lines from the contest the will playbook. But my father had been thorough. Michael produced medical evaluations from his cardiologist and primary physician, both stating he was fully capable of understanding his decisions on the days he executed the codicil and annex. The video of him speaking, clear-eyed and articulate, played in a judge's chambers, his voice echoing off the paneled walls one more time. I testified about that afternoon at my kitchen table, about his anger when he realized how the prior documents had cornered me, about his insistence that he set things right. Michael and the two board members who'd signed the resolution testified about the special meeting where they'd discussed succession, about how my father had overridden their concerns about family politics with that stubborn Hayes certainty. Valerie's lawyers tried to make the USB look shady. They suggested I'd tampered with it, that I'd inserted instructions after the fact. But they didn't have evidence. And the no contest clause hung over the proceedings like a thundercloud. In the end, the judge upheld the codicil and annex in their entirety. He referenced my father's recorded statement more than once in his ruling, calling it a compelling and contemporaneous expression of testamentary intent. Valerie's challenge triggered the clause she'd been warned about. The $500,000 bequests to Chase and Lily survived. My father had structured them as separate gifts, insulated from the no contest penalty, but Valerie's additional cash gift was reduced to a token amount. Most of the legal fees for her failed case came out of her share. She kept the house. She kept enough money to live comfortably. But the days of treating the company like a never-ending fountain were over. As for the company, that was a different kind of battle. The board had technically approved my succession, but that didn't mean walking into the office as CEO was simple. There were department heads loyal to Valerie, middle managers who'd courted Chase, hoping he'd be the one signing their bonuses. Rumors swirled about how I'd schemed with Michael, about how I'd hacked my own inheritance. I didn't waste time trying to convince everyone of my version of events. I figured results would speak louder than rebuttals. The first thing I did was sit down, one by one, with people who'd actually been there when the company was a truck and a toolbox. Foremen who'd eaten cold sandwiches in job site trailers. Engineers who'd pulled all-nighters on design calculations. Admin staff who'd stayed late answering phones when bids were due. I listened, really listened, to their worries, their frustrations, their ideas. Then I started making changes. Contracts Valerie had pushed us into that didn't make sense financially. We renegotiated or walked away. Pet branding projects Lily had championed that had no measurable ROI. Cut. Chase's consulting agreements that paid him six figures to show his face at meetings twice a month. Terminated with severance and a non-compete he didn't bother reading until it was too late. Not out of spite, out of necessity. We shifted focus back to what had built Hayes Civil and Steel in the first place, solid mid-sized infrastructure jobs where our reputation actually mattered. We invested in safety training and equipment upgrades. We promoted from within based on performance, not on who kissed whose ring at the Christmas party. Slowly, the numbers started to turn. The first profitable quarter after the chaos felt like a breath of air after being underwater too long. The second felt like confirmation. The third felt like momentum. One evening, about 18 months after that while reading, I stood on an overpass outside Cincinnati, watching the sun set over a line of Hayes trucks heading back to the yard. The concrete under my feet vibrated faintly with passing cars. The air smelled of exhaust, wet earth, and that particular metallic tang of rebar and rain. In my hand, as always, was my mother's keychain. The tiny engraved bridge caught the last light of the day. I thought of her, of my father, of that kid in the truck, listening wide-eyed as Dad ranted about weight limits and load paths. "I got it, Dad," I murmured into the wind. "I've got it from here." Later that week, I drove to the cemetery. It was a gray afternoon, the kind of Ohio day where the sky feels like a lid pressed down over the world. I parked, grabbed my coat, and walked the familiar path between rows of stones. My father's grave was near my mother's. Hayes. The names looked stark against the polished granite. Someone, probably Valerie, still came by sometimes. There were fresh flowers in a metal vase by his headstone. I knelt anyway, brushing a fallen leaf away from his name. "I thought I'd feel like I won something," I said quietly. "But it doesn't really feel like that." The wind rustled through the bare branches overhead. "It feels more like, we finally fixed a mistake," I went on. "Like we're even." I pulled the little USB drive out of my pocket. Michael had given it to me the day the judge upheld the codicil. "It's part of the file," he'd said. "But I think your father would want you to have this. Just don't lose it. It'll make my life hell if the IRS comes calling." I turned it over in my fingers now, the cheap plastic casing unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it contained. "This stupid little thing caused an awful lot of trouble," I said. Then I smiled, just a little. "No," I corrected myself. It revealed the trouble that was already there. I tucked it back into my pocket, next to the keychain. Standing up, I looked between the two stones. My mother, who'd taught me to stand up straight, to say please and thank you, to do the right thing even when it was hard. My father, who'd taught me how to work, how to fight, how to build something that lasted longer than you. They'd both, in their own ways, told me to remember where I came from. Valerie and her kids had tried to rewrite that, to make the Hayes legacy about houses and cars and parties rather than about I-beams and deadlines and payroll envelopes handed out in brown paper. For a while, they'd almost succeeded. But in the end, my father chose to trust the version of himself that had built everything. The version standing in the dust with his hands on his hips, not the one smoothing his tie at a gala. He chose to trust me. That was the part that stuck in my throat more than any money or titles. He'd messed up. He'd admitted it. And then, instead of hoping it would somehow sort itself out, he'd done the uncomfortable, complicated work of putting it right. He'd risked Valerie's anger. He'd risked more family drama. He'd swallowed his pride and walked back into Michael's old-fashioned office and said, "I was wrong. Help me fix it." Not everyone gets that from their parents. Not everyone gets that kind of final gift. I put my hand flat on the cold top of his headstone. "Thanks," I said simply. When I turned to leave, I felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. Valerie and I would probably never sit at a Thanksgiving table together again. Chase sent me the occasional bitter email about what could have been. Lily, to her credit, came by my office once and asked, cautiously, about maybe doing some real work in the marketing department instead of just slapping her name on things. I told her if she was serious, we'd start her at the bottom like everyone else. Families don't get magically fixed by legal victories. Wounds don't vanish when a judge bangs a gavel. But there was a kind of justice in knowing the story hadn't ended with me politely accepting whatever scraps my stepmother chose to hand me. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I hadn't had to scream or cheat or lie to get here. I'd just had to be patient, pay attention, and be ready when the moment came. As I walked back to my truck, the wind picked up, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint clang of construction somewhere in the distance. Maybe that's all any of us can really do when we've been cut out, underestimated, or written off. Wait, watch, and be ready. Ready to plug in the metaphorical USB when the time comes. Ready to say, calmly and clearly, no, that's not the story my life is going to tell. In the end, my father's secret drive didn't just flip the inheritance. It flipped something inside me. It reminded me that revenge, at its best, isn't about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming what was yours all along and building something better on top of the ruins. I opened the truck door, slid behind the wheel, and curled my fingers around the little bridge on my keychain. Then I turned the ignition, pulled out onto the road, and drove back toward the company that bore my name, ready to keep building.